9:35, I think we'll get started. Can you guys hear me okay? Am I coming across all right? A little quiet maybe? All right, I'll try to speak up a little bit. All right, good morning. How did everybody's week go this week? Have a good week? What about yesterday? Wasn't that a nice preview of summer? I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to the summer months. It's nice to see leaves on the trees and some color. Well, I hope you find today's class very helpful. I had a terrible time this week trying to organize my thoughts. In fact, up to about 9 o'clock Friday night, this was just little notes spread throughout all my desk. I had trouble putting it together. So even about 90 minutes ago, I was putting the finishing touches on the PowerPoint. So I hope that you find it helpful, and I hope that it's not too scattered and it's easier to follow. But as the Bible says that we're not to worry about what we are to say, the Holy Spirit will provide. So with that in mind, if you wouldn't mind, turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. We are in the series called The Life of Christ, and as the name suggests, the series is going through the life of Christ, and we're taking a look at the Gospels to see what it has to say on the various stages. And so this is week 12 of 13 of this series, and not only do we cover this on Wednesday, or Sunday, but we do as Wednesday as well. And we're live streaming if you can't make the Sunday morning service. So as I said, Matthew chapter 5, beginning with verse 17. And would somebody mind reading verses 17 through 20 of Matthew chapter 5? Sorry, allergies are getting to me. All right, so let's take a few moments to review what has happened up to this point. So we're studying the Sermon on the Mount, and as we looked last week, this is just a lesson that Jesus taught. It was on the side of a mount, hence the name Sermon on the Mount. And it says in the Bible that the people were amazed at the things that Jesus had said, and he had spoke to them and taught in a way that no one had ever taught to them before. And so last week we studied the Beatitudes, and Jesus, he wasn't messing around with his lesson. He jumped right into the meat of it and talked about different traits and different character traits that are needed for those that are in the kingdom. And then this past Wednesday, Jason led us on a discussion of the preceding verses about salt losing its saltiness, which is not only a warning against complacency, but it's kind of instruction for us to go out. We are to be seasoned, like seasoning, like salt is on food. We are to go out and season the earth with the good news of the gospel. I always like this phrase, it's up to us to tell his story and not ours. And so that's what we're called to do, is to go out and tell Jesus' story. And so let's just dive right into what Jesus had to say. So if we beginning with verse 17, it says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets." Now, I always got the gist of what that meant, but let's take a minute to look a little bit deeper. So the law consisted of 5 books. It says Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's also called the Pentateuch. And I'll always remember that because kind of a funny little story. When I was back in college, I was in a room with about, 6 or 8 guys. We were eating dinner, and we were watching Jeopardy. I don't know, but that's the scene we were. So we're watching Jeopardy. And one of the questions was, this is what the 5 books of the Old Testament are also called. And without missing a beat, I said the Pentateuch. And at that point, the buzzer went off, nobody could get it, and Alex Trebek says, well, what is the Pentateuch? And I had 8 set of eyes kind of all go over and look at me like, how did you know that? I don't know, I heard it in a Bible class sometime, but from that point forward, I always remember that the first 5 books of the Old Testament are also called the Pentateuch. So moving on in the prophets. So the prophets were, as you can imagine, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. So these are the prophets that wrote books at the time. So when Jesus says the law and the prophets, he's essentially saying, what we refer to as the Old Testament. So if you want to paraphrase, he's saying, I have not come to abolish the Old Testament, but to fulfill it. And so to understand why Jesus might have said this, we need to take a look at some of the preceding events. So if we, you don't need to turn there, but if we go back to Mark chapter 2, beginning with verse 23, we see where Jesus had challenged the Pharisees about picking grain on the Sabbath. He and his disciples were hungry, and so they needed food, and so they were picking the grains, and the Pharisees had challenged him on that because of the law against working on the Sabbath. And then a little bit later in chapter 3, beginning with verse 1, we see Jesus heal the man with a shriveled hand on Sunday. Jesus' line was, is it good to do right on the Sabbath? So to the Jewish people, it looked like he was there to abolish the law because he was going against the teachings of the Sabbath. But Jesus was there to tell them it's not about following the law, it's about following God. And they were so busy, Jesus' teachings were, serve the poor and forgive your enemies and love your neighbor as yourself. Those things were radically different than what was being taught of the day. And so the Jewish people, they were so busy following the letter of the law that they forgot about the spirit of the law. So to them, they had such a perverted view of what it was. To them, it looked like he was there to abolish. Even today, Jesus' teachings are exceedingly simple, but very incredibly difficult to live. But again, the takeaway here is that Jesus wasn't there to abolish the rule, but rather to refocus them so that they keep the main thing the main thing. Any comments? Right. Yes, good point. Anyone else? Right. Moving on to verse 18. It says, I tell you the truth, this is Jesus speaking, of course. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not a smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. So this is another verse where I get the gist of what he's saying. But if we look a little closer, the smallest letter in the Greek alphabet is the 9th letter. And then when Latin scholars, and again, this is according to Wikipedia, I am not a Latin expert by any means, but according to Wikipedia, when Latin scholars transcribed the 9th letter into the Greek alphabet, they spelled it either iota or jot. Eventually, those became known as references to very small things. So that's where we get the phrase, not one iota. So it's just referencing something very small. Least stroke of a pen. So according to the same source again, this phrase means horn, and it was used to designate the slight embellishment on certain characters. So like if you ever see a European write, spell something out, they always cross their Z's, or if you know how to write in cursive, all of the loops that you have to do. I saw a meme this week. It says, my daughter watched me write in cursive. Now she thinks I'm bilingual. But it's just a skill that is not taught much anymore. But those of you who know how to write cursive, there's a lot of embellishment. So really, this is just hyperbole. Jesus is saying that I'm not here to abolish the law. In fact, not one small thing. We might say not one dotted I or one crossed T will fail to come true or will come true. So Jesus is there not only just to say, I'm not here to abolish it, but he's re-emphasizing that everything in the law, even the smallest detail, will come true. Any comments? All right, moving on to verse 19. Anyone who breaks the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commandments will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. what's the cliche line in any type of a prisoners movie, when prisoners are talking? What are you in for, right? Does it matter? Everyone there has broken the law, and everyone there, regardless of what they did, is in the same place. And unlike our prison system, there isn't a minimum security hell. So it's foolish to think that if we didn't commit one of the major sins, that somehow our punishment will be less. I mean, sin is sin. It's not subject to gradation. Anyone who doesn't repent is going to end up in the same place. So there's a couple ways to look at that. One, it's pretty obvious that teachers are held to a higher standard. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. I mean, there's no doubt about it that, the things that I say today, I need to practice on Monday. And that's the way that God intended. But many of us may not be official teachers, but we're mentors. I look up to many of you as mentors as well. And whether we want to think it or not, we are all teachers of God's law. And when we teach others bad habits, having a critical spirit, whether we gossip, it may just be something, simple, but still gossiping, we make it difficult for others to come to Jesus. And that's what it means here, is when we put up roadblocks for others and make it more difficult, that we'll be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Any comments? I'm missing Dave here. Moving on to verse number 20. So for I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you certainly will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So when I first read this, or when you first read it, it kind of sounds a little discouraging, because it kind of sounds like that we need to be more righteous than the experts of the law. But to understand what Jesus is saying, we need to take a little bit closer look at Pharisee. So if you remember back in week 2, which I'm sure you all do, and if you can believe that was March 13th, seems like forever ago, but week 2, we talked about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And I'm not going to rehash that lesson, but I do want to point out, or pull out a couple facts. So the Pharisees were experts of the law, and they were the teachers. They were who we would refer to as the clergy today. And I believe, if somebody correct me, I think the Pharisees, they had to memorize the Pentateuch, or at least most of it. And so they knew the Old Testament very well. I mean, letter for letter, word for word. They knew it far better than we do. But they also considered traditions of the elders as binding law. Now, I'm pretty sure this is correct. I took extra effort to make sure it was. But in the Old Testament, there are 248 commandments of things that we ought to do, thou shalt. And 365 commandments of things that we're not permitted to do, thou shalt nots. So in God's law, there are only, I think, 613, if my math is right, 613 rules. Well, the Pharisees, intending to keep people on the right path, would make extra rules so that you wouldn't violate the original ones. And this is where we get the nonsense like you can't go more than a half a mile, you can't carry this, but you can carry that. And so you get these really strange and very difficult to follow rules. And I believe one source said that there were over 1,500 rules in total that the Jewish people were expected to follow. But the Pharisees didn't follow that. They were sanctimonious, they were self-righteous, they considered themselves to be God's VIPs, and they had more confidence in their goodness than they had in God. And that's really what bothered Jesus, is that they were hypocrites. And if you look at the word hypocrite, the Greek word itself is really a compound noun. And what it said here, again, according to Wikipedia, it's made up of 2 Greek words that literally translate as interpreter from underneath. The bizarre compound makes more sense when you know that the actors in ancient Greek theater wore large masks to mark which character they were playing, and so they interpreted the story from under their masks. So when you look at that definition, it kind of brings hypocrite a little bit to more light. They're one thing in public, but behind the mask, they were someone else. And that really bothered Jesus. Are there hypocrites today? Yeah, of course. I brought this up a couple times, and I love the idea. When Jesus got angry in the scriptures, he didn't get angry when Peter denied him. He didn't get angry when Judas betrayed him. He didn't even get angry at the Roman soldiers who beat him. He got angry at the religious people who cared more about the rules than a relationship. So I got a silly illustration here. Does anybody see anything wrong with the way I'm dressed? It's not a trick question. I didn't intend there to be. Yeah. But I grew up in a church where the guys wore suits every Sunday. Now, back in the mid-'80s, that really wasn't unusual. I mean, guys wore suits. And it wasn't a rule of the church, but it was a tradition. It was something that we've always done. And as far as I know, no one was ever turned away at the door for not wearing a suit. But how inviting was our church to somebody who couldn't afford a suit? I mean, it's not a really perfect example because no one was called out for not wearing a suit, and they were welcomed in. But I'm wearing jeans here on purpose because had I worn jeans back then, that would have been a huge commotion. But yet today, no one really noticed it until I said something. So what we wear obviously doesn't matter. It's our attitude towards it. And it shows how Phariseeism, if I just made up a term, how Phariseeism so easily can take over. I mean, it's so easy to spot it in hindsight, and it's very difficult to spot it in the present sense. Like for example, we have an order of worship that we tend to do. 2 songs communion, 2 songs in a lesson. I mean, if we were to change that, would that cause anybody heartburn? Or are you just excited that we're here to worship God? If we change the style of music, instead of doing old hymns, we do more contemporary choruses. Is that a problem? Or are you just excited that we're here worshiping God? So what Jesus is saying in verse 20 is that, when it comes to right living, we need to do far better than the Pharisees if we want to enter the kingdom of heaven. And you know what? I get that. But that's really where I struggle. Because, when you look at the scriptures, they seem to contradict one another. So we see here in 1 Corinthians where it seems as if Jesus is telling us that we're not to associate with people who are sin. And it says here, don't associate with anyone who bears the name of brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed or is an idolater, reveler, or drunkard. I've got a lot of friends that fit some of those people in that category, and I definitely hang out with them, and I'm not going to change that. We also see in James where it tells us that we are to be merciful and meek and forgiving one another. So how can we not associate with somebody and call out sin, but also be merciful and meek and honor both scriptures? Well, Jesus was, unlike us, a perfect balance of grace and truth. And we see that in John chapter 1, verses 14, where it says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, that we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." And we see this illustrated, if you wouldn't mind, if you go to the right a little bit, to John chapter 8. So if we flip over to John chapter 8, we can see a little bit of this in demonstration. So I'm not going to read the passage here, but essentially what has happened is that there has been a woman who has been caught in the act of adultery. I mean, this just wasn't an accusation. Somebody caught her in the act. So she's guilty. Everybody knows that she's guilty. She knows it. Jesus knows it. Everyone in the audience knows that she's guilty. But how did Jesus respond to those people? Well, it kind of depended on what you were there for. If you were a Pharisee who was demanding justice, Jesus, tell us what the law says. They were trying to trap him. So how did he respond to those people? Started writing in the sand, it says, right? Now, we don't know what he said. I'd love to know what he wrote in the sand. But I'm guessing that whatever he wrote was truth. I mean, God can't lie, so he was writing truth. He was probably reminding everybody of their sin as well. And so what happened? One by one, they fell away until no one was left. And then he turned his attention to the woman. She was there seeking grace. I mean, she knew she was guilty. She didn't have a defense. The only thing she could ask for was grace. And so Jesus turned to her and said, "Go and sin no more." Now, if you notice, he didn't ignore the sin. He just didn't wink his eye and say, "Don't worry about that." He just said simply, "Go and sin no more." So he gave truth to those who were seeking truth and gave grace to those who were seeking grace. And I think we can draw from that. And I've got a kind of a silly illustration to show that, kind of shows a little bit of context. So I promise you, even though sometimes it doesn't look like it, I know the difference between there, they are, there, T-H-E-R-E, and there, T-H-E-I-R. I understand that. Now, I'm a self-taught typist. I do not know how to type. I grew up in an era where computers were not really a thing, so I've had to learn over the years. And as a result of that, my mind talks faster than I can type. I'm sure many of you are in the same way. And so I always have to be careful to go back and reread my work to make sure that I'm using the right word. If you saw last week, I had thrust instead of thirst in one of it. So when I did spell check, of course it didn't catch it because thrust is spelled correctly, but I just had the wrong word. So the point is that, when I read other people's work and I see a random spelling error, a grammar error, okay, I understand what they're getting and what they're trying to get across, and I just move on. Unless it's something that's posted online or something that I know is going to be referred to often. I might say something to them. I'll pull them aside and tell them about the spelling error or something like that so they can be corrected. And my intent's not to show them where they're wrong, but it's just to try to help them present a better product. And that's what we can do in our Christian lives as well, is when we have the right attitude and help others get better, then we can address those things. But if somebody were to come to me and ask me to proofread something, I'm going to point out every error that I could find because they've asked me to do that. And so I think, using this somewhat silly example of how we can address others, when we see our non-Christian friends sinning, maybe we can, maybe we can't, but, as God brings people into our lives, He brings them into us with different levels of closeness. You have more influence over your spouse or your best friend than the barista at Starbucks. So you have more leeway to address things. And so that's, again, that's where I struggle, and that's really where we have to work with God to understand, where we need to address, where we need to stand up and say, hey, this is wrong, or where we give grace. And again, I'm kind of rambling here because I was trying to put these thoughts together this morning, but anybody have any thoughts or anything that might add? Exceeding God's expectation. Oh, that's good. It's hard to exceed God's expectation. But to exceed man's expectation is, it's like the verse in Colossians, in all that you do, do with all your heart as if working for the Lord. Because if you please God, you're going to please man by default because God's standards are so much higher. Right. Yes. If I was a perfect typist, it would be very easy to me to be critical of everyone. When we don't struggle in an area, it's easy to become critical with somebody who is. But we all have areas where we struggle, and it could be an area where they don't, and they can come, that could come back to get us. And I think that's what I really think that's what God's intent was. He's like, stop being critical. This is a macro sense. Stop being critical of everyone and help one another. You can help someone so-and-so with this thing. You can help someone here. Oh, and by the way, they can help you with your struggle. And so that's what I think that this is coming from. It's not telling us to be quiet. It's just telling us to pick our battles, if you will. Make sure that we have the right intent and the right mindset. We want to help one another. Oh, sorry. Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. You know, when you're asking somebody to proofread something, you're opening yourself up to criticism. And, you know, it's different if it's an essay, but, you know, maybe there's something aspect of your life that you're not really sure about. And so you confide in a friend, you know, here are the details. Sometimes the details are embarrassing, but having that second set of eyes on that and having another opinion will help. Yes? Mm-hmm. So, you know, we can, I guess you're trying to ask, how's what I'm saying fit into the, mm-hmm. Oh, I, I understand. So the Pharisees thought they were righteous, and so they were good. But Jesus is saying, wait a minute. You can't. You're not. You're never going to be righteous enough to get into heaven. Did I capture that right? Yeah. Does anybody have an answer? I'm not. Yeah, please. Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, self-righteousness and pride, they go hand in hand. And when you're prideful in one area, then that tends to bleed over. And like you said, it just kind of leads into other areas. Um, and it takes over. And then it just kind of clouds you. Like I said with the example of wearing a suit on Sunday, that was never a rule. That was just somebody wanting to look their best. And, many times these rules have good intentions in mind. It's just when they get taken to the extreme is when we get into trouble. Thank you for your comment. Anyone else? All right. I appreciate you listening to my random thoughts this morning. It's exhausting being in my mind, and I was hoping to put things down in a way that you could follow, but I wanted to summarize everything this morning for the purposes of this lesson. So, as I said, this is a section of Scripture that is fit in between, being Jesus warning us about being ineffective, but also challenging us to be seasoning and go out and spread the good work. And Jesus is telling the people that, hey, I'm not here to change anything. I'm here to fulfill the law. But what you know to be true is so different than what is actually true. It's going to sound a little different. And so he's just preparing them for the things that are coming to follow, which is what Jason will pick up on Wednesday when we start getting into the meat of the Sermon on the Mount. Before we close in prayer, are there any other comments? Yeah, Joe. Mm-hmm. Yep. That's, yes. I want to have your spell check because you said you changed it from as to add. My spell check does it some way else. Does another three-letter A word. So yes, absolutely. It's great story. I appreciate that. That is hilarious. It's just kind of building upon that. When you read things and you see typos and people that get bent out of shape about that stuff, what happens? They're so worried about how the word's spelled, they forget what the word's trying to say, and they lose the message. And that's the point here, is that, it's not, we just want to make sure that we're not so worried about whether or not somebody's wearing a suit, make sure somebody's, showing up at 9:30 sharp every Sunday, just to make sure that we're helping them get to find Jesus. Jeff, would you mind closing us in prayer?